So today on Practical Church Planting, Brian and I are going to be sharing 6 things that we learned from Exponential, which is a church planting conference that we attended recently. So hopefully some of our lessons will be helpful for you. Here we go.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Drosian. Joining me in a tie is Dylan Dodson. Right. And today we're talking about 6 things that we took away or 6 things that we learned from Exponential Conference.
So if you're not sure what Exponential is, they do a conference every year in Orlando. They also do regionals now. Yeah. It's a big one, church planting conference. We went, we've gone multiple times. And so we just want to share some things we learned. If you were there, hope you learned stuff as well. If not, you're about to learn what we learned. So
that's right.
We're going to do 6 things. Brian, why don't you kick us off? What's one thing you learned at Exponential?
Yeah, so the first thing I learned at Exponential, and there's the thing about it is there's, if you've never been there, there's tons of advice you can get from everyone in the world, basically. Some practical, some more theological. But one thing that I took away is to be confident in your calling. As a pastor or as working in ministry, to be confident in your calling. I think we talk about it, at least you hear a lot about making sure that you're called or getting people to affirm that you're called, that you actually have a calling to be in ministry. But if you believe you do, I think there's something to be said to actually have confidence in it. And to, I guess it's okay to have some insecurities and question it. We are people, but to stop questioning your calling and actually be confident in what you're doing.
Yep. I think it was good. I think I've shared here before. I know I've shared with people I know. When we launched New City Church, I was so insecure about so many things. And not to say that you ever are not fully not insecure about stuff. But I just was like, nobody's going to listen to me. I'm not good enough. I don't know anything, blah, blah, blah. Yep. And that's just true. Like most of us aren't. A lot of times we look at people who are successful and been doing it forever and be like, I'm not that person. Well, yeah. They were also not that person when they started. And so if you feel like, man, God has really led me to do this, just like lean into it, be excited about it, and know that God has created you with the giftings he's given you for a reason. You're not supposed to be somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we don't need to, and I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, but not to beat yourself up over insecurities. We are humans. You know, It's okay to be insecure at times, but if you have people that are affirming that you're called and believe that you're supposed to be doing what you're doing, and you've actually have the right motivation behind what you're doing, aren't doing it to promote yourself, then be confident in it. And you're not there by mistake.
That's good. Well, one of the things I took away a few things. I was talking about this before. Larry Osborne's a pastor in California. He's written some books. Yeah. I think he's really helpful because he's very practical, which is practical church planting. So I went to a few of his breakouts. One of the things he talked about was, and I'm going to probably not say it the exact right way.
Butcher it.
There we go. He says he talked a lot about not responding publicly to criticism. Now, it's different if there's a sin issue leveled against a pastor in the church or whatever. Right. But if there's like slander being said or mischaracterizations as you as the pastor or your church or whatever, he talked about how you actually should not respond to it because the news cycle is your friend. So, for example, if somebody accuses you of being a super big jerk and lying to them, while that's not fun, he said if they were then to address it, write a blog post about it or whatever, about 8 reasons why this is not true, well, very few people even knew that it was a thing. And now everyone that's hearing your response is going to go read and find out what the original problem was, and now everyone thinks there's a problem when there wasn't. Yeah. So I just think it's helpful, especially in ministry, when we sometimes can get upset, we get said things about us that are not true often, that you want to respond. And sometimes you want to respond not because you like want to clear your name, but you want other people to know, hey, like this isn't true. But I just think it's helpful, again, unless it's a big sin issue, if somebody leaves you a bad review on Google, gives you 1 star, like oftentimes if there's only one bad 1 star, whatever, people will look at that person like they're crazy anyway. Right. And so although it hurts and although it stinks, it's just helpful to know if someone says something about you personally or the church, and it's not a big sin issue, even if you don't like it, it's a good idea to kind of leave that stuff alone, because then you're going to draw a lot of attention to something that most people didn't know about to begin with.
Yeah, that's good. This one, this was in a breakout that I wasn't a part of. So when we kind of recapped the conference, I remember you were telling me about this, and I was kind of surprised at first because it's human nature to want to be defensive. If someone's attacking you, obviously you want to be defensive, and not always for a bad reason. You know, if they're saying something negative about people serving at your church, it's natural to want to stand up for them, even if it's not against you personally. But when you kind of sit back and think about it, you're totally right. And no one else is going to listen to this one random person, most likely. I mean, most people know the truth. Right. And to kind of give it more attention than it needs, all it does is...
And even those that do listen to that person, there's no perfect damage control. Most cases, you're going to make it worse. So just letting it go sometimes is the wisest thing that you can do.
Yep. Next thing I learned from Exponential 2019 is, this one's not as... It might not sound as practical at first, but I think there are practical things you can do, is not to put limitations on God. The theme of this conference was called Made for More. And when I first heard the theme, I thought that they were going to talk about how, you know, were we're made for more, so we can all, expect to have a bigger church and a bigger following and stuff like that. That's kind of where I thought they were going, which I wasn't very excited about. But really what they were talking about is that God can do more. That doesn't necessarily mean more people coming to your church, but he can do more than we can. So not to put limitations on God when it comes to kind of like we talked about before, your own insecurities or other issues that you come up that kind of get you down or kind of put barriers that you put up, like things like money. Think we don't have money to afford things. Not to put those kind of earthly limitations on God when obviously he is above all those things.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's good. I think so often too, we say no for people and for God all the time. Like maybe you need to raise money and you're thinking about planning a church and you're like, well, this person's not going to give.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's not up for you to say no to things. And so I think so often we have dreams and desires, and oftentimes we don't pursue them or try things, that we should because we're afraid of them failing, or we have all these excuses as to why it shouldn't work, as opposed to thinking about one of the things I think is most helpful is instead of thinking all the reasons why you shouldn't do something, think of all the reasons of if you do it and it goes well, that you and other people would miss out on.
Yeah.
And so of course you want to make wise decisions and not do something stupid, but again, we put a lot of limitations on God instead of just going for what he's called us to go for and see what he would do.
Yep.
So number 4, another thing I learned also from Larry Osborne, because this is also practical. I was like, oh, this is good. And he wrote this about this in his book, Lead Like a Shepherd. And I just think it's worth repeating because it's so good. He talks about how if you want to be a leader, one of the things you need to do is learn to live with low-level frustration. And what he means by that is not you being frustrated at other people or being frustrated at things not going the way you want, but you being okay with people being frustrated with you as the leader. Because if you're a leader, again, you're thinking about this all the time. You've got all the different areas of the church to consider when you're making decisions. Most people are not aware of everything that's going on. And so they might get frustrated with you because they don't know all the facts. They don't understand why certain things are happening, and because you can't really sit down and explain everything. We're not talking about like adding a service, which we talked about the previous episode.
Right.
But let's say you're doing something and people don't like it. Like as a leader, people will always be frustrated with you, and oftentimes it'll be because they don't have the full picture. And also, if you're a leader, your job is to lead people to somewhere, and sometimes that destination is not fun, the journey is not fun, even though everyone wants to get to a certain place. Oftentimes we don't realize it takes a lot of work and things we don't like to get there. So as a leader, it's just good to be reminded that people will be frustrated with you, and in some cases your leadership capacity is kind of capped to how much you let that bother you. Again, if you're being a jerk, then that should matter, but you just got to know people will be frustrated with you because they don't have the full picture. And if you want to lead well, you have to be okay with that.
Yeah, I think one sign of kind of maybe an immature leader is someone who, people get frustrated with you, is to then get frustrated back at their frustration. To think that everyone should see things the way that I see it, and if they don't, then why don't they? Because I have a clear path, or I have a clear vision where we need to go, but everyone kind of is dragging it down and doesn't have the vision that I do. When in reality, they're a different person. If that really what that means is you haven't really given them the full vision, or you haven't shared with them the vision of where you're going. So people will be frustrated, and your job as leader is to not be in turn frustrated right back at them.
That's good. Yeah. That's so good, Brian. You're so smart.
Oh my goodness. Well, that leads into the last thing.
Number 5. We got 2. Last thing for you.
I took away. We have one more after that. And this was from Joby Martin, who's a pastor in Jacksonville, Florida. And this wasn't like a point that he made, but this is what I took away. So I don't know if this is what he meant to communicate or not. And that's to don't try and be smart. Don't try and sound smart. Don't try and sound smarter than you are. And what I mean by that is what he talked about a lot is you can have all the degrees in the world. You can know everything about each passage you're preaching and want to break it down to the original languages and kind of communicate all the information to your people. But in reality, all that's going to go way over everybody's head.
Right.
And people are not going to be able to communicate or not going to be able to connect with the gospel. And so what he was saying is learn the scripture, yes, and obviously nothing wrong with being educated and learning these things, but the sign of a good pastor, a good communicator, is if you can take those things and communicate it in a super simple way.
Right.
So what he talked about is basically what he does is he says, I have a passage, and all I do is I explain to people what it means, and then tell them the gospel, And I thought that was really good. I think he talked a lot about not, which we've talked about before, not preaching like you're preaching to your seminary professor.
Right.
And just remember that people in your congregation, they don't necessarily care about all this background information. All they really need to know is how it connects to them and how it connects them to Jesus.
Right. And I think that if you're just starting out in ministry and you went to seminary, preaching to your seminary professor might be a problem that you need to make sure you try to avoid.
Right.
I think for most of us, though, that maybe have been doing this for a little bit, it's not so much the seminary professor, but it is, as they talked about, other pastors.
Yeah. Oh,
like
that
that are never going to listen to your podcast or sermon anyway. And you're like, well, what would they think if I said this? Who cares?
Right.
Like, they're not listening to you, and you're not preaching to them. You're preaching to your people who are busy or distracted. Some of them really love Jesus. Some of them don't even know who Jesus is. And so making it really applicable to them, not for people who are never going to listen to your sermon anyway. And I think there's a lot of internal pressure to sound smart. And it's not just because you want your people to think you're smart. I think, in at least my experience, it's more so because you want other people in ministry who might come across it to think you sound smart.
Yeah.
But you're not in ministry for them.
Well, that's good. And I forgot that you mentioned that, actually, because I've experienced that, because I didn't go to seminary. So I've at times preaching, thinking like, some of my friends that are pastors hear this. What are they going to think? Are they going to think I kind of measure up to where they are? But in reality, none of them are ever going to listen to it. I mean, I love them, but they're not listening to my message.
And it doesn't matter if
it doesn't matter. I mean, I'm preaching to the people who actually came that day, not just hoping that I'll impress somebody else.
Right. Yeah. And then number 6, one thing, this was not really said, but it was just a great reminder, especially when it comes to communicating and preaching, that storytelling and humor are so important.
Yeah,
and I think sometimes we try to say it's just about preaching the gospel, which we talked about. Go listen to all episodes. We say that's a bad idea. That's a bad reason for anything. Yes, just to preach the gospel, but if you want to connect with people, you can't just preach it. Anyway.
Yeah.
But the best 2 people, in my opinion, at Exponential, who I wouldn't say the best, but to me, they are, because there's lots of different speakers. They go for about 20, 25 minutes, so you can hear a lot of people that communicated the best.
Yeah.
Were Albert Tate and Joby Martin. If you don't know who they are, it doesn't really matter. Albert Tate, and I've heard him before, master storyteller.
Yeah.
Joby Martin, we could not stop laughing.
Yeah.
And neither of them were necessarily like trying to do this stuff to sound cute or do whatever, but it was because that's what connects with people. I remember reading a book. I don't know if I mentioned it in a recent podcast or not. I read a book about preaching recently, and this guy was talking about how he went to summer camp when he was in high school, wasn't really a Christian, but kind of was. And he can remember these 2 camps that he really enjoyed. One camp, he can't tell you one thing that the communicator said all week. The other thing, he can still tell you to this day, this is like 30 years later, things that he learned. And he said, you want to know the one difference that nobody wants me to say? The one difference between those 2 is that the one guy was really funny and the other guy wasn't.
Right.
And humor and storytelling, that's just what connects us with people. So yes, we want to preach the gospel, kind of what Brian was just saying, but you've got to do it in a way that connects, that brings people's guard down, that invites them in. I mean, Albert Tate, I could have listened to him speak for like 2.5 hours.
Yeah, totally.
Which on here we talk about how it's not really smart to preach forever and ever and ever. But I could for him because he was so engaging. And so it was just a good thing for me to come back and I want to get better at these things, but always try to find different ways, read different books, listen to different people. How can I get better at communicating through storytelling and humor? Because that is what brings people's walls down, and that's what really allows people to, like, when you're laughing, you can tell me anything you want. And what's so fascinating about humor is that if you make someone laugh and then you tell them something deep or even something that's hard to hear, they'll be like, "Yep,
yeah,
I'm listening. Yep, that's true."
Totally,
because they feel connected to you in some ways. And so I was just reminded of the importance of storytelling and humor and preaching and communicating.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciated about Joby, who's really funny, but he said in one of the breakouts he did was more about preaching and advice for preaching. And he mentions that, but he says that don't try and be cute. Basically, It was kind of, I'm messing up. That's kind of basically what he said, is don't try and be cute. If you're not someone who enjoys talking like that, don't just try and force being funny because it sounds awful. But he preaches the way he naturally speaks, so if that's the way that you are and you're kind of like, jokes are a dumb example, but if you like to tell jokes or you're kind of a funnier person, then use it. But if you're not, don't try and force it and make everybody
and I think
really
even more than that, if you're not naturally funny, I think you can grow in it. So I think that's a bad thing to say, well, I'm just not funny. But you got to be like funny for you. So like if you're not very funny and you love corny dad jokes, like say corny dad jokes, that people will think that's funny because they know you.
Don't try and be something that
don't try to emulate someone's joke if that's not you. Find out what it is for you and try to find ways to grow in it.
And one thing I wanted to add before we close in regards to that, one thing I thought was just awesome was the last Joby was the last speaker of the entire conference. So at the end of it, they have this big
Brian,
call
I think you really enjoyed listening to Joby.
He's good. They have this big call for people who are called to be church planners to come down to the front, and it's this huge thing, and it's a very serious moment. It's not like a lighthearted thing. But in the midst of him kind of giving this invitation and the band's playing behind him and this serious thing, I don't remember what exactly he said, but he said something that was kind of like a joke right in the middle of it. And it was at a time where I would have never had the guts to tell a joke at that time. And it fit in well with it and everything, but it totally gave people just a chance to breathe for a second, but then he got right back to it.
Right. And
which I thought was just like masterful, because it was not like it right at the beginning of the message, and then it was serious the rest of the time, where it's easy to tell a joke. But it was right at a moment where people probably needed a chance to breathe a little bit, and he could see that and was able to throw it in real quick, but then bring everyone right back on track. And I think it helped people give people a chance to breathe, but also helped them stay focused even longer.
So, hey, those are 6 things we learned real quick. Have confidence in your calling. Don't respond to every critic or every criticism. Don't put limitations on God. Living with a low level of frustration is needed for healthy leaders. Don't try to be smarter than you are. And storytelling and humor matter greatly in speaking.
Yes.
So thanks for listening today. If you have questions, practicalplanning.com/questions, or join our Facebook group. We like to talk about stuff in there.
We sure do.
Thanks for being with us, and we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.